Hey, this is John. How are you today? Today I'm going to be working on the pilot figure for Hasegawa's Ammoknight from the Maschinen Krieger property. And I've already primed him with some Vallejo primer and given him a coat of Tamiya olive green. I think it was XF62, but I may be wrong. I wanted to go with the olive green because it just reminded me of the pilot uniforms that I saw so often when I was in the Army. I'd see the helicopter pilots all the time and when we would fly with them, and it just kind of reminds me of that. Now the procedure I'm going to be following it's a bit simplistic, but what I want to do is start off by just giving a good old-fashioned dry brush to this figure as it is now, not only to bring out some of the highlights, but I want to use it to kind of map the highlights. It helps me see where the highlights are, where the parts are. I mean, not that I can't see them now, but it really gives me a good visual on what I'm going to be doing in terms of shadows and light and contrast. So I'm going to start off with, like I said, just a very simple dry brush, and then I'll go back in and begin blocking in the different parts of the uniform that he has in a variety of colors, and then continue on from there. To start things off, I've mixed some Vallejo model color 70894 camo olive green and model color 7953 flat yellow. What I was going for was basically just a lighter olive green. There wasn't a specific ratio that I was going for. I just kept adding drops and adding drops until I got it like I wanted. Then I thinned it with a little water just so it's not too terribly thick. I'm going to be using a really large soft brush for my dry brushing. I like when I'm doing general dry brushing like this on anything, a figure, a model, a cockpit, whatever. I like using this really large soft brush because it does a good job of getting the color on it. It holds plenty of paint, but it's not so harsh that it can rub paint off. If you're not careful using the dry brush technique, if your brush is too harsh, at times on some edges, depending on the paint you've used and the primer you've used, it can actually take paint off the edge if you're not careful. So I like using this really soft brush. So I'm just going to get it in my paint, and I'm going to wipe off quite a bit of it. The big brush does absorb a lot of paint, but at this point I want to get plenty of color onto the model, like I said, to help me kind of map out where the highlights are. And I'm just going to start in lightly dry brushing him. And getting those mapped out. All right, he has been dry brushed. As you can see, I got him all over, and it just gives me a good idea where all of the highlights are. It also starts adding some fading and color variation to the suit itself. So I think it lays a good foundation for painting the figure. Now the next step is I'm going to jump straight to painting the basic color of his face. I'm not going to do the whole face painting yet, but I want to go ahead and get in there and get that painted now that I've got the dry brushing done. I may need to do some, if I get a little bit on his collar, I can use the Vallejo camo olive green to touch up because it's a very close match for the Tamiya paint. And I'll get his face painted and begin blocking in the rest of the colors around the suit. To get started on painting the flesh, I'm going to use Citadel's Bugman's Glow. Don't ask me about the name. I don't know. But it's a very dark flesh-ish type color. I've got a number 2 round brush with a pretty good point on it here. I've already thinned my paint in my palette, and I'm just going to get just the barest amount on the end of my brush, and I'm just going to begin putting in the paint right at the edge of the face. Now there's a little, I doubt it can be seen on camera, but it looks like he's actually wearing some kind of covering under his helmet. One of those, oh, what's the word? Fire suit. That's what I'm looking for. That you often see race car drivers wearing. And it's right up at the edge of his face. In fact, it comes right under the chin, which now that I'm really looking at it carefully is going to help me out a lot, because that's going to mean I have less flesh to paint and therefore less of an edge to worry about. But by getting your paints thinned, getting my paints thinned, these aren't your paints, these are my paints, you go get your own. But by getting the paints thinned to a very smooth flowing consistency, it's easy to paint on in these very little strokes. One of the things that I've noticed in watching figure painters, I like watching figure painters work because it's instructive, obviously, to learn how to paint figures, but just their brush painting techniques in general are very, very informative to watch. And I always notice they tend to work in very small strokes and really just putting on the barest amount of paint, especially when they're working up next to another color. So it's something I've tried to emulate a little bit as I'm growing in my figure painting. I actually do quite a bit of figure painting off camera. I'm working on this guy right now. He may show up later on down the road. I work on those quite a bit just to try and grow my skills. So if you've not watched figure painters on YouTube or something like that, give it a shot, because even if you're not painting figures, they're very good at imparting wisdom when it comes to brush painting and painting small areas and shadow and highlight and the things that go into making up some good brush painting. Look at that cat hair. We have cats, and I don't think I've built a model in the last decade that didn't have a cat hair somewhere embedded in it. So anyway, I'm going to continue painting this guy's face, and I'm going to get it fully coated, but it's not going to be completely opaque yet. And then I'll go back and let it dry and give it another layer or two so that it gets up to full opacity and we can begin working on the other parts of the figure. Okay, I've painted in his face and I stayed mostly within the lines. I kind of surprised myself. So next I'm going to go in and I'm going to block out his fire suit, the word that I couldn't think of before. I'm going to block out his fire suit. I think I'm going to use a lighter color just to help make everything stand out, to give a little contrast. And then I'll block out a few other elements and continue on. Okay, I have the fire suit blocked in, and it frames the face nicely. It does exactly what I had hoped it would do. It really kind of brings some attention there that I hope in the end will look nice. Something I wanted to point out, as I was doing this, I would occasionally my brush would go astray, my hands shake a bit, so my brush would go astray and I would get a stray mark here and there, and used to I let that really frustrate me. But as I watched more and more brush painters, figure painters specifically, working, I noticed that depending on the painter, that they were very, it was no big deal to go back and make a correction here and make a correction there and make a correction here, and it's just like this little process where you you get a little out of the lines and you go back and you correct that, and you go back over the line the other way and you correct that, and you know, you keep going back and forth. And obviously, as your skill improves, you have to do that less. But it was encouraging to me to realize these guys that do these amazing figures, they go in and they make corrections, and when something's not as neat as they want, they go back in and fix it up. So I say that just to, if you're like me, working on painting figures and working to get better at it, don't get discouraged if you go outside of the lines, so to speak, because the ones who do this so well do the same thing, and they just go back in and make a correction and come back and make a correction until they get it exactly like they want to. Now, I'm sure as I worked on this guy, that I made probably a few more corrections than someone who's a much more skilled figure painter would do, but I'm pretty happy with the results now that I'm done. So I'll continue painting in more color and blocking out the rest of the suit. All right, I've gone out, and I'm not gone out, I've stayed right here. I've gone ahead and blocked out the rest of the colors on the pilot's suit. I used a darkened version of the camo, the olive green, for these other elements on the suit. It was kind of hard to tell what went where. Some of the lines of the equipment were indistinct. So instead of trying to pick them out as different elements, I just decided they would all be a dark green, which made it a little easier. I did paint these pieces here a blue-gray because they kind of reminded me of armor pieces that back in the early mid-90s, when I was in the Army, there was some body armor that we tested out that had additional pieces of armor that you could put on your vest. And then there were also times that we wore knee pads when we jumped. I was a paratrooper when we jumped to protect our knees, and so it just kind of reminded me of that, so I went with it, figured it was good enough for government work, as they say. And I painted the helmet sky gray, so I'll eventually go back and do some white highlights on that. Now these blue-gray areas I painted with Vallejo Model Color 7816 Luftwaffe Uniform World War II. It's a pretty nice color. And I've mixed some up in my palette with a little bit of white to lighten it down, and added quite a bit of water. This paint is really, really thin. And basically I'm going to be doing the technique much like in the first video for this series, where I offload some of the paint and I'm left with just the barest amount on the brush, and I'm going to start pulling it from the bottom up on this piece of armor and work around and do each of them that way. Because what I'm doing is I'm taking advantage of the fact that the brush stroke leaves more paint at the end than the beginning. And because the paint is so thin, it's not depositing a lot on there, but it's putting a little more color at the end of the brush stroke. And I'll continue going around in this fashion on each piece of armor until I've built up highlights along the top of the armor, and the lower part will remain darker, because the next row, just as I did in that video, the next time I do it, I won't start at the very bottom, but I'll start just a little higher up. And I'm just putting the barest amount of paint on there. This is an effect that you have to build up. It works fairly nice, but you have to build it up. Have to have some patience for it to, I guess you'd say, come to fruition. but it gives a lot of control over the gradient. I started doing it this way. I've seen others do it, but I think I use my paints a little thinner than what I had seen others demonstrate, because I didn't find that I don't know if it's just lack of practice with the technique or lack of brush control or what it is, but I was having a really hard time executing it. But I found if I thinned my paints down even further, that I could make it work. It just took a little longer. So if you've had trouble trying to build up gradients like this, consider giving this a shot. Thin your paints down a little more and just take more time to build it up, and see how that looks for you. So I'm going to continue doing this and then show you what it looks like when I'm finished. I've gone in and done these armor plates, trying to build a gradient. I'm not sure if I wasn't a little too subtle with it. I'm gonna keep my eye on it as the rest of the model develops, and I may go back in and punch up the highlights just a little. I thought the knee pads turned out a little better. They're a little closer to what I was looking for. I may just need to go in and add some shadow along the bottom, but because I haven't done any kind of shadowing or washing, I'm going to wait to see if I want to make some adjustments there. That's one of the things that as I'm learning more in brush painting, and especially figure painting, is that notion that I had that you just have to make constant adjustments as you're going along. You're seeing how it's developing, you're seeing how the parts interact, and then occasionally you may punch up a highlighter or dull down something that you want to be a little more muted, and just continue that process throughout until you get it like you want. The next thing I'm going to work on is what for me is the hardest part, and that's the face. So let me get the paints prepared and we'll talk about doing this guy's face. All right, I'm going to paint the eyes. I'm going to start with the sky gray. I want to see how that looks, and I'm just going to get just a dot, because I don't want him to look like he's just woke up in the morning, or he's, you know, plenty rested and his eyes are bright and he's ready to go eat his breakfast and take on the day. I'm hoping to develop a look for the pilot so that he looks as if he's just back from a mission and he's tired and he's wanting some sleep. Let me lick my brush there. And he's just wanting the paperwork and the after action reports and everything else to just kind of go away. And I know that feeling. So, very carefully, I'm going to put in this color here to establish that part of his eye. Now, if I get a little outside the edge, that's okay, because I can go back and correct it with the original Bugman's Glow base color. Now, before you put the pupils in, when you get it painted this way, he takes on kind of a scary, demonic look. And if that's what you're going for, then you're there. But I'm not going for that, so we won't leave it that way. And with my hands shaking, man, this is not easy. But such is the life, eh? All right, there, I've got that in. By the way, I used my Army Painter Wargamer Regiment brush for this. It's got a nice sharp point. And I'll go back in and make a few corrections with Bugman's Glow, and then I'll put in the pupils. Okay, for painting the eyes, I'm going to use the black-gray color that I've been using, and I'm going to break out the Wargamer Insane Detail brush. It has a very, very fine point. Doesn't hold much paint. It's actually not a real practical brush to use for many things, but I think in this case it'll be exactly what's needed. And I get just a tiny dot of paint, and what I try to do is I try to start at a particular angle and dot it. And I missed. Let's try and reestablish that. That'll work. Now, to come in at the same angle and try and get it in there on the other side. Well, I think I may go with that. It's not perfect, but the way my hands shake, and as difficult as those are to paint, the main thing is I don't want him to look a little loppy-eyed. And he looks like he's looking off in the distance. And the pupils appear to be about the same size. There's actually just a tiny dot in the middle of one that I didn't get any color, but it actually gives it a nice little bling of glow. So I'm going to leave it at that and continue working on the rest of the flesh tones. All right, for painting the mid flesh tones, I guess you'd say, I'm going to be using Citadel's Cadian flesh tone. I like these colors. They work for me. Not that I've done extensive skin tone painting, but they work for me and they're what I have, so I go with them. I'm probably going to invest in the Vallejo flesh tone set eventually, because I kind of like some of the colors in that. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start by painting the areas that I know are going to be the highlights, because again, because of my inexperience in doing this, but also just because I'm a bit hesitant in my brush painting skills, I kind of start mapping out, I guess you'd say, the most prominent areas, even though these are going to later get another coat of a lighter paint. I want to start at the highest points and gradually work towards the lowest points, so that in this process it will initially look fairly exaggerated, but as I bring it all together, hopefully, and hopefully is the key word, hopefully it will start looking more blended and he won't look like Mimi from Drew Carey. So I'm going to continue this process, and when I'm done with it, or at a part that needs some more explaining perhaps, or asking forgiveness, I'll show you where we're at. I'm still in the middle of painting on the Cadian flesh tone. It's starting to develop, and I like where it's going. But I wanted to point something out, and I hope I can get this in focus. But as I've begun painting faces more, I've realized that the painting process takes place like this, right there. You're right up on it. But realistic viewing is at most here. And so one of the things that I've seen a few painters point this out, figure painters point this out online, is they say don't spend all of your time crammed up at the face here like that. But every now and then pull back and see how it looks, because as you pull back, the various colors and tones and shadows and highlights and all of that will start taking on a more natural look to them. So I think it's important that, because for the longest time I had thought it had to be perfect here, right up close. And I'm sure there's some people that can do it that way, but I realized I've got to start getting a natural looking face here at this distance or even further, rather than being too concerned about, are my transitions perfect right there? So that may be a helpful, some helpful information. That may just be me excusing my lack of skill in painting figures. But I think it's certainly something to think about. So I'm going to continue painting on more of this Cadian flesh tone, and then we'll see how he looks. Well, I think I'm at the point that I've done all the damage I can do with Cadian flesh tone, so I'm going to switch over to Citadel's Kislev Flesh, which is a lighter color. You can see the three colors here: Bugman's Glow, Cadian flesh tone, and Kislev Flesh. And you can see how they relate to each other and how they can be used to create pretty convincing flesh tones, I think. But I've got it in my palette, and I'm going to go back to my Army Painter Regiment brush, and I'm going to get just the barest amount on. And this time, and this is the part that's kind of scary for me in painting faces, because I'm actually fairly happy with where it's at now. I want a little more highlighting, but I'm fairly happy with it now. But this is the point in painting faces that I usually blow it, and I get it too highlighted, and it begins looking comical. So this time I've thinned my paints quite a bit. That was my cat. He was saying hi. Yes, we hear you, boo-boo. Sometimes he wanders around. It's actually 5 o'clock in the morning, and he comes wandering in and just wants to see what's going on. He's 21 years old, and he's blind in one eye, partially blind in the other, and mostly deaf. But other than that, he's fine. Anyway, I'm painting this on, and I'm trying to be very, very subtle about it, because I don't want, as I mentioned, I don't want to blow it. So I'm really starting here just on this most prominent feature, the end of his nose, to really try to bring that up and then see how it looks. So I'm going to continue doing this around the rest of his face with the same color, and then assuming I don't mess it up and completely start over, I'll come back and talk about how it's looking. I've painted on the Kislev Flesh, and I'm not unhappy with it. I can't say I'm entirely happy with it, but I'm not unhappy with it. I think it'll work. Again, up close it may not work quite as well as it does from a distance, but it's developing where I want it to go. So given my hand steadiness and my experience level, I'll go with this. The next thing I want to do is I want to add just a bit of hint right along his jawline and just on his upper lip, just above his upper lip, of just a hint of beard growth. And so what I want to do is I'm going to take some of the Luftwaffe gray that I'd used for the chest armor, and mix in just a dot of it with some of the Kislev flesh and go in and just very lightly glaze over that, because I just want just the barest bit of tint of a little bit of beard growth. Because if he's been out in the field, he's just come back from combat, he's been sitting in that armored suit for a while, he hasn't had time to shave. And if he's been out for more than 12 or 15 hours, you may see that. If he's been out 24 or 36 hours, that may be there, because even when you're out in the field, you may be able to shave from time to time, but the shaving you can do out in the field is not near as complete as the shaving you can do when you're in your own bathroom. So that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. But I'll go in, get the paint set up, and see how that looks. All right, I've got my color here on my palette right there, and it's just a mix of this Kislev flesh and a few dots of this Luftwaffe blue-gray. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to test it. And see, that's not thin enough. I want it to be thinner than that. I want it to be basically glaze type level. So let's see how this works. Get some of that off my finger, off on my finger. And you're really just looking for the barest whisper of paint to come off. So now I'm going to go in and just barely glaze that on. Right along his cheeks, on his chin, and above his mouth. I don't want it to be a severe color change. I don't want it to be drastic. I just want it to be enough of a tint to suggest what's going on there. And again, this may be, sometimes it can be easy to get so subtle that you can't see something. And so I may have to go back and put this on a couple of more times to build it up. But it's better to build it up slowly. Apologies if that's out of focus. It's better to build it up slowly than to put on too much and make him look like he's been eating a blueberry pie at a country fair. So I think right now I'm at the point of so subtle you can't see it. It's starting to build up over on this side. So I just need to keep going and give it a second to dry so I can see the results. But I'll continue doing that and we'll see how he looks. All right, I've finished that process of adding a little bit of 5 o'clock shadow, and I think it worked. Up close it's a little, maybe a little stark. I mean, like this up close. But at normal viewing distance, I like it. And you know, I don't know what it is about my face painting, but I always end up painting somebody I recognize. Like the first Maschinenkrieger model I built, a new rally pawn, I painted the pilot's face and he ended up looking like Mr. Spock. This, maybe it's just me, but this looks like Jeff Goldblum to me. So I didn't start off trying to paint Jeff Goldblum, but I appear to have painted Jeff Goldblum. But that's okay, we'll go with it. Now, I'm considering adding a little more color under the eyes. You'll notice that I left the eyes a bit dark under here. I wanted him to appear tired. And quite often the indication of darker circles under the eye, you know, bags under the eye, and it's kind of hard to get that look, but darker circles under the eye kind of gives someone a more gaunt tired, exhausted look, and that's what I'm hoping to convey with this. So I'm not sure if I'm going to leave it like it is. I think what I'm going to do is leave it for now. Quite often when I'm painting something, if I'm not sure if I like it, I'll leave it be and look at it a few hours later and then determine if I actually do like it. So I think I'll just leave him be and then come back and look at it later and see what I think of it. But the next step I want to do is I want to add a little bit of additional highlights all around the uniform. The dry brushing mapped them out nicely, but I want to go in and really punch up a few of them, not all of them necessarily, but a few of them, to really give some contrast, because the step after that will be to go in and add a little bit of shadow around his uniform to help bring those out a little bit. So let me get my paint set up and I'll get started on that. To work on these highlights, I'm going to use Model Color 7917 Beige. I like this because it's yellowish so that it works with the green in terms of highlights, but it's not as stark as just using plain yellow would be. So I've got some in my palette and I've thinned it down fairly heavily, and I'm just going to get a little on my brush. And I'm not trying to, I think as I'd mentioned just a moment ago, I'm not going to try and get every single highlight. But what I want to do is look for the areas that are the sharpest highlights. Like right here on this sleeve. And I want to go in with just the barest line. And I have to rub it a few times just to get some paint to go off onto the highlight or the fold. But that's what I'm going to do in various places around the pilot's suit. Because to sell that this is a real person, just like in real life, there has to be light and shadow. There has to be contrast. And we can't always depend on the lighting overhead, the lighting in the room, the lighting wherever the model is being displayed to be sufficient to bring out those shadows and contrast. So by punching them up a bit, we help the viewer, we kind of sell the notion of what's there better than the actual light and so forth in whatever viewing area we're at does. So anyway, I'll continue around the suit adding in these highlights, and I'll probably add in some on these darker green pieces also, and maybe a few other elements, and then we'll see where we're at and look at adding the shadows. I'm still in progress painting the highlights, but I wanted to reiterate something. This is another area. Remember when I was painting the face, I mentioned the difference between this viewing distance and this viewing distance. It's really critical here also, because how it looks here, get him in focus, how it looks here is very different when you're evaluating your highlights than how it looks close up. So every now and then, and I'm going to have to go off camera here to do this, but every now and then as I'm painting, because as I'm painting this, I'm holding him like this and I'm painting, and I'm right up on it with my Optivisor. And every now and then, I just take him and hold him out at arm's length. I know he's gone off camera, but trust me, he's still there. But I hold him out at arm's length and I see, okay, am I getting those highlights where I want them, how I want them, how's it looking? And if it gets a little stark, you can always go back in and use some of the base color to knock it back a bit. But I just wanted to point out that it's really important to keep in mind that viewing distance factor, how it looks between here and here. Whoops, here. Because that will mean a whole lot in terms of how you see your model and how you evaluate your work. So I'm going to continue working on this, but I just wanted to reiterate that because I think it's such an important point. Okay, I have the highlights to my satisfaction. They're not perfect, but they'll work. The next step will be to go in and add some shadows. So I'll get paints prepared and go over that process, and we'll see how it progresses from there. All right, the next step in completing and getting the pilot finished will be to add in some shadows to contrast those highlights that I've added in earlier. So what I've done is I've mixed up some of the camo green and just straight black, both Vallejo, and I'm going to get a little on my brush here, and I've thinned them out quite a bit, so it's going to be applying the paint much like I did earlier, where it's very thin, and I'm just trying to add in natural looking shadows, nothing too harsh, with the goal being for it to blend in with the rest of the uniform color. Now what I'll do is I'll go around across the rest of the pilot's suit and get this painted in and show you what it looks like when it's finished. All right, I've gone around his suit and added in the shadow areas. It's a very slow, gradual process of just going in and essentially doing this, where you're adding in just the barest amount of color in various areas. And then, like I talked about earlier, you pull back to a distance and look and see where you think the shadows need to be deepened a little bit. And then you come right back in and add a little more. What I've been doing with the paint is really thin, but what I've been doing is loading the brush up, wiping off most of it, and then I actually lick the brush so that it's going on super thin, and then it's just more of, like I said, just more of this. Now it goes on a little starker than it will dry, so I've had to keep that in mind as I put everything on, but I think it's starting to really make the uniform overall really stand out. And I'm pretty happy with how this looks. I mean, I wish I was further along as a figure painter, but you've got to put in the time like this to get there. So if you get nothing else from this video, if you're an accomplished figure painter, you can probably look at it and recognize that you at one point had been at this step. And if you've not tried to paint figures, I think this shows, because it's not a half bad looking figure at this point, I think, but I think it shows that you can paint figures. It just takes time. The thing I'm learning as I grow in figure painting is patience. It's really, really a process of adding a highlight, adding a shadow, blending things in, taking things away, straightening things up. It's a real process of just back and forth and back and forth. And I'm sure once you get better at it, it goes a little quicker, but it does take time. So I'm going to continue on around the rest of the suit, adding in various highlights, shadow, around his boots, on the darker green parts, and just get him sorted out. And then we'll see what I'm going to do with this helmet here, because it's looking kind of flat. So I'll continue on and show you the results as I get done. Okay, you ever have one of those ideas when you're building a model that the idea is much better than the execution? That's what I've run into on this helmet. The idea of a white helmet sounded really cool. Until now. So, and Jeff Goldblum has a green helmet. Just wasn't working for me. So I went with the camo olive green, which is pretty much the color of the uniform. And this is, you could see, I don't know if you can see the paint still drying right there. I like this better now that I'm looking at it. This is the look of the uniform I was basing on what I remembered of Army aircrew uniforms when I was in service. And their helmets were usually this green color or something similar. So, you know, there's a good tactical reason for it, and I think it helps frame the face better. And it's going to be easier to add some highlighting. I just wasn't happy with how I was handling the white. So, yeah, sometimes you got to step back, reevaluate, and maybe issue a fragmentary order and move forward. So I'm going to work on highlighting and shadowing that, work on the gray straps, and I think, and maybe his gloves, and I think that's just about going to finish up Jeff Goldblum. So I'll show you what that looks like when I get those steps finished. All right. I have painted his helmet green, giving it just some slight shadowing around that contour there, and a few little highlights here and there. I finished off his visor, the gloves, the belts. I even took a little bit of pencil, number 2 pencil, and just lightly dusted over that buckle looking thing right there, and used a Q-tip to just kind of polish it up a little bit. But I'm going to call this guy finished up. I'm pretty happy with it. I'm certainly no figure painter. It's not the primary thing I focus on, but I do want to have this one standing beside the Ammoknight. Because the Ammoknight will be open and you can see the interior, I thought having the figure next to it might look pretty nice. So I think this will sell the fact that this is a dude. Maybe Jeff Goldblum starring in a movie about machining Krieger. But I've ended up being fairly happy with it. There was a couple of points through the process that I was thinking, this just ain't working and I need to try something else, but I'm fairly happy with it. I have thought about adding a decal to the back of the helmet like you often see, especially U.S. Navy pilots do, and I may end up doing that. But for the time being, I'm going to call this guy done, and that will wrap it up for this video. The next one in the Ammoknight series, I'm planning to be the weathering and the finish of the Ammoknight itself. And I'm not sure if I'm going to film doing a small base, mainly because I don't know that I've done enough bases to impart anything useful I'm beginning to wonder after filming this figure whether I'm imparting anything useful. But I hope at least I've shown that, you know, anybody can do this. It just takes a little bit of time and a little bit of practice, and I certainly plan to practice this more. So thank you so much for watching. This is a Patreon exclusive video. If you do want to share this with a friend, if you would please share the link to the Patreon page that this is on, not the YouTube video, I'd be most grateful. And certainly I'm most grateful that you are a Patreon supporter. It really does allow me to pursue things in this hobby in terms of content and equipment, and hopefully improving the production of everything I do in a way that just wouldn't be possible apart from your support. So thank you very much for your support, and I look forward to finishing up this Ammoknight and seeing how he's going to look. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.